And now to introduce our 2 o'clock Interfaith Lecture Series here in the Hall of Philosophy, where this week we are presenting the theme, Spirituality in an Age of Anxiety. Our distinguished guest today is Dr. Shadi Hamid. Dr. Hamid is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and the author of Islamic Exceptionalism, How the Struggle Over Islam is Reshaping the World, which was shortlisted for the 2017 Lionel Gelber Prize for Best Book on Foreign Affairs. He is also a contributing editor for The Atlantic. His previous book, Temptations of Power, Islamist and Illiberal Democracy in a New Middle East, was named a Foreign Affairs Best Book of 2014. Dr. Hamid served as Director of Research at the Brookings Doha Center until January of 2014. Prior to joining Brookings, he was Director of Research at the Project on Middle East Democracy and a Hewlett Fellow at Stanford University's Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. Dr. Hamid received his Bachelor of Science and his Master of Arts from Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, and he received his PhD in Political Science from Oxford University. You will be pleased to know that Shadi will be doing a book signing today immediately after his lecture on the porch of the Hall of Missions, and that his books will be sold there as well. The title of his presentation today is Islam and Identity, How Religion Provides a Common Language in an Age of Anxiety. Shadi Hamid is a returning Chautauquan, I'm so happy to say, having spoken here in 2015, and he is remembered with great appreciation for his insights at that time into the continuing struggles and perils within Iraq. The Department of Religion is enormously pleased to welcome Shadi at this time to this podium, and so I ask all of you now to join me in expressing our great pleasure that he can be with us for this week's important conversation. So please now welcome Dr. Shadi Hamid.
Thank you, Maureen, for that kind introduction. It's great to be back here at Chautauqua. I love this place, actually, and I was talking to a friend yesterday and telling them that I was at this place called Chautauqua, and I always find that it's sometimes difficult to describe exactly what this place is like, but I settled in the end on a little utopia, so you guys can use that in the future if you'd like. So I guess I'll just get right to it. Something doesn't feel right. And that's why we're all here, and that's why the theme of these discussions is the age of anxiety and the role of religion and spirituality in addressing the anxiety that many of us are feeling. And I think this year in particular, we're feeling it, let's say, a little bit more than we're used to feeling it. So this is an opportune time to have this discussion. Now, the fact that something doesn't feel right, in some sense, that's part of the modern condition. And none of us, no matter how old we are, were alive in the pre-modern era, right? So one thing that all of us here share is the disadvantage of not knowing how things were before in the pre-modern era. So whether it's 1,000 years ago, 4 centuries ago, 3, and so on, we don't know what that was like. And many of the things that we now take for granted are actually, in fact, quite new in the scope of human history. So something as self-evident, it seems to us, as the nation state, or being a citizen, these things are actually fairly recent developments. And just to take one example, and I'll return to this a little bit later, if we look at the last caliphate, the Ottoman Caliphate, people were not citizens of a caliphate. Their primary allegiance was religious. So if you were a Jew in the Ottoman Empire, your primary relationship was to the local Jewish community, to the local rabbi. That was who you were, in a sense, responsible to. If you were a Muslim, that was your primary identity. So you were a Muslim rather than an Ottoman, per se, or you were a Christian rather than an Ottoman. So what we've had essentially is that these previous allegiances, whether they're religious or communal, they've changed. And now our primary allegiance as Americans or wherever we might be from is to a state. That is a fundamental shift in human history. And I think it's just worth sort of emphasizing that because it doesn't seem very radical or new to us because that's all we've known. Now, this shift, this fundamental shift in human history is great in a lot of ways. So we live in, at least for now, a liberal democracy. That's great. We have freedom. We have individual choice and agency and autonomy. We make our own choices about our conception of the good life, what we want to believe in, what we don't want to believe in, our conception of God, and so on. We have the freedom to make that choice. And for the most part, no one is telling us what to believe. That's wonderful in a lot of ways, but it's also come, let's say, at a cost, in the sense that it's harder to find a collective identity that binds us all together as Americans because we're all doing our own thing. And that can be a little bit overwhelming, all the choices we now have, which are quite literally unlimited. And I'll just give you one example of that in terms of my own life, which might seem I'm sort of being flippant here, but so I live in DC, and I wanted to start doing yoga last year. So you'd think this isn't a very weighty decision to make in your life, but I then looked to see all the where would I go to do yoga in DC. There were literally 50 different yoga studios in a 2-mile radius of where I lived, and I felt a little bit overwhelmed with all of these choices. Or when I started to do meditation, I had to sample a variety of different kinds of meditation. So you have to put in a lot of effort, and that can sometimes come at the expense of our contentment or happiness. And some of you might be familiar with this example from behavioral economics, where they've done sort of natural experiments on this, where if someone goes to a supermarket and wants to buy a jar of jam, and they have 3 jars to choose from, and then they choose 1 out of the 3. That's one option. Another option is if you have a lot of different choices, and let's say 27 jars of jam, you choose 1. What we found in behavioral economics is that if you have 27 choices, you end up being more unhappy and not content with your choice after the fact, because you're thinking to yourself, well, I had 26 other choices. Did I make the right choice? And that can be a difficult thing to deal with. So we have these choices when it comes to religion. I mean, most of us stay in the religion that we were born, but ultimately we have a variety of religions that as Americans we can technically, if we really want to, choose. And we can go out of one religion and into another, and so on. So this is sort of part of the trade-off that we're living within, that it's great to have all this freedom, but it comes with a lot of choice, and that can be overwhelming. And, in some ways, this is what some of you might be familiar with the idea of the end of history. So Francis Fukuyama wrote this famous essay in 1989 at a time when we thought ideology and identity, that we were essentially, the world was moving towards an end point, that other ideologies were falling by the wayside, whether it was Marxism or even the idea of religion playing a prominent role in public life. And there was this idea that we had reached the end of history and we were all going to be living in liberal democracies, or at least most of us would be over time. And that would pretty much be it. And there would be tinkering around the margins. We'd try to improve quality of life. But the fundamental questions about what kind of systems of government we would have and how our societies would be ordered would more or less be resolved. But what we found out is that liberal democracy has not won the day. Liberalism in the classical sense of emphasizing individual freedom and individual choice, there has been, if you will, a revenge of ideology, a return of ideology and identity. And everywhere we look, there is this fundamental struggle for meaning, if I can put it in kind of broad terms. And so whether we want to look here at the rise of white nationalism or ethno-nationalism in Europe with far-right populist parties, the rise of a sort of a Catholic conservative party with authoritarian leanings in Poland, the rise of Viktor Orban in Hungary, far-right Hindu nationalists in India, Duterte in the Philippines, the right wing in Israel, Islamist parties in the Middle East. Really, if you can look across cultures and regions, and that seems to be the universal phenomenon that we're all sort of struggling with right now. So this struggle for meaning is universal, but the form that this struggle takes is not. And the form that it takes can change or differ from one region to another or one culture to another. And this brings me to the question of how we understand the role of Islam in all of this. So if we take, by way of contrast, if we take the US, you would have thought that over the past couple years, it would have been really an ideal time for Christianity to make itself more relevant in public life. There was sort of this vacuum of meaning, this vacuum of ideology, but instead of political Christianity, to use the term, really coming to the fore, instead we have basically the ethno-nationalism or white identity politics that some would associate with President Donald Trump. So, and that in some ways is a product of the decline of mainstream American Christianity, that Christianity no longer binds Americans together the way it did several decades ago. So it leads to this sort of be careful what you wish for scenario, because I think a lot of us, especially those of us who come from a secular background in sort of the northeastern liberal elite bastions, and I guess we're technically in the Northeast here, that, sometimes we see religion playing a very overt role in public life as not being super positive. It can be divisive, it can be polarizing, but it's be careful what you wish for, because if religion declines, something else will likely take its place. And that thing that takes its place is not necessarily going to be better or preferable. So this brings me, by way of contrast, to the Middle East, but also more broadly a number of Muslim-majority contexts in South and Southeast Asia, where in the struggle for meaning that we've seen in recent years, Islam has been the primary reference point. So when we're talking about the most important opposition parties, civil society movements, they tend to have a religious orientation. And sometimes we use this word Islamist to describe these groups. And I'll come back to that word a little bit later. So the question is, why would Islam be the primary reference point in many of these countries when it hasn't been, say, in Europe or in the US? And this gets me to the question of whether there's something fundamentally different about Islam. Now, as Maureen mentioned, my most recent book, it's titled Islamic Exceptionalism. So you can probably guess from the title that I'm arguing that Islam is, at least in some way, exceptional, not just in any way, because all religions are ultimately different from others. Otherwise, what would be the point of religion? Anyone who feels strongly about their religious orientation is going to think that there's something unique or distinctive about what the religion offers them, at least on the personal level, right? So I'm not quite arguing that. I'm arguing that Islam is exceptional in a specific way, in how it relates to law, politics, and governance. So in theory and in practice, Islam has proven to be resistant to secularization. So where we've seen considerable secularization in Europe and to a lesser extent in the US, we have not quite seen that in many Muslim-majority contexts. So Islam continues to play an outsized role in public life and politics in many of the countries that we hear about in the news, particularly in the Middle East. Now, I'll offer just a couple caveats because I have to be careful, because we obviously live in a time where there's a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment, and some people use the term Islamophobia. And so I'm not saying that this distinctiveness is bad. Distinctiveness can be both good and bad, depending on the particular context. So that's one thing. The other thing, too, is that even if Islam plays an outsized role in public life, that doesn't mean it takes one form. So what we call Islam is actually a very rich and diverse tradition, and there are more conservative or even, and obviously far-right extremist interpretations of Islam and Islamic law, but there are also more open-minded, progressive interpretations of Islam and Islamic law. So when we're talking about Islam, we're not talking about one thing. We're talking about really a rich tapestry of traditions. And even when we're talking about that very contested word, Sharia isn't one thing either. There are more conservative interpretations and more progressive interpretations. So it depends exactly what we're talking about. And I think the other thing that's worth mentioning is that religion can provide some really positive things, not just on the personal level, but also in terms of society and community. And I think some of you will take that to be obvious because you've seen that in your own lives and your own communities. But in terms of building social cohesion, in terms of building new states, so one reason that the Islamic empire was able to spread, for the most part peacefully, through conversion and not through, there were obviously battles as well, but one of the founding ideas that drove Islam's growth as a religion was it had a powerful founding idea. The same thing with Christianity. Why was Christianity able to spread throughout the world? Because of the power of a founding idea that binded new communities together and inspired new communities, right? So these are positive things that religion can do. It can help build new societies, if you will. So I want to add that caveat because I want to challenge this idea that if religion stays relevant, that this is automatically a problematic thing. It depends on what form it takes. Now, I'll mention just two quick aspects of why Islam might be distinctive in this way. The first requires us actually to go back 14 centuries and actually maybe even 20 centuries if we want to compare it to Christianity. But when we look at the founding moment of Islam, we see something that is different in the founding moment of Christianity. So Prophet Muhammad wasn't just a prophet, a theologian, or a religious figure, or a man of God. He was also a politician. And not just a politician, he was also a head of state. And not just a head of state, but a state builder. So naturally, if the Quran is being revealed to Muslims in 7th century Arabia, it's going to have something to say about law and governance, because the early Muslims were thrust into a situation where they were capturing and holding new territory, and they had to find ways to govern this new territory. So the Quran had to speak to that particular set of circumstances. So governance and law mattered for the early Muslim community. Where if you look at Christianity, Jesus Christ was a dissident against a reigning state. He was not ever in a position to govern a piece of territory. So naturally, the New Testament is going to have less to say about public law and governance. And then there's also a number of verses, as some of you will know, in Galatians, where so Paul says in Galatians, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. So there's even a sense that of moving away from this idea of the law, at least the law in the traditional sense of the Old Testament. The second factor that I'll mention is how Muslims relate to their scripture. So if you talk to, again, I'll just use Christianity because it's what most of us are familiar with here in the U.S., but if we look at even the most far-right Christian evangelicals, they will say that the Bible is the Word of God, but that does not mean that they believe that the Bible is directly, that every word or letter is directly from God. There is a belief that there are human authors. So for example, Paul is someone who is considered one of the authors of certain parts of the Bible. Where with Muslims, as a creedal requirement, all Muslims believe that the Quran is of divine origin, that there is no human role or no human authorship. Every letter and word is directly from God. And that's an important distinction, and it has implications for how people understand Scripture. And I think sometimes Muslims, and as someone who grew up in the Muslim community, Muslims will sometimes do a kind of one-to-one comparison of the Quran to the New Testament, when that's not actually how it works. The Quran is actually better compared to Jesus Christ himself, the Word made flesh. So in that sense, Scripture plays a different role in the different traditions. And it's not a one-to-one equal comparison. And I think sometimes Muslims will say, well, the New Testament is not directly from God. Well, how does that work? Well, that's because Scripture plays a little bit of a different role in these different traditions. So what this means in practice is that you can sort of argue for secularism in the Islamic context, but it's harder to make that case, and it's harder for that to gain mass traction today throughout the Muslim world, because it sort of goes against the prophetic model of intertwining religious and political functions. You can do it, but it's a bit of a harder sell, and that's why in many of these countries, secularism is not something that's been able to spread beyond a relatively small number of elites. Anyway, so for the better part of 14 centuries, from Islam's founding until the present, until fairly recently, Islam provided the overarching moral, legal, and religious architecture. That Islam was just the order of things. No one really questioned it. So it went without saying, so it wasn't said. You didn't have people who called themselves secularists in the pre-modern era because that idea didn't really exist yet. Everyone accepted that there was something called Islam and Islamic law that provided an overarching compass for these societies. It's only in the modern era where you have these new ideas of secularism and liberalism that you start to have a new debate in the Islamic world about the role of religion. Now, in that sense, we've had a fundamental change and a fundamental shift in the Muslim world, where these ideas of Islam being the overarching compass have changed. And so I mentioned earlier the Ottoman Caliphate. So it was formally abolished, but not as long ago as you might think. And I don't think that there might actually be a few people left somewhere in the world that were alive when the Ottoman Caliphate still existed. So it was formally abolished in 1924. So I guess if you're around 100 and you would have perhaps lived under certain parts of the Ottoman Caliphate. So it seems like a long time ago, but it's actually fairly recent. And ever since 1924, there's been a struggle to establish a legitimate political order in the Middle East. And at the center of that struggle are a set of unresolved questions about the role of religion, Islam's relationship to the state's relationship to Islam. And so when I'm trying to understand, or when I'm trying to explain the problems that we're seeing in the Middle East today, we can talk obviously about the rise of ISIS, the Iraq War, the Arab Spring. All these recent dates matter, but we really have to go back to 1924 and even well before that to understand that there is a vacuum of political and religious authority that really stems from this crisis, a modern crisis of what comes after the caliphate. How do people order their societies in the Middle East and beyond? Now, the main divide in many of these countries is between what we would call Islamists and non-Islamists. So Islamists are basically those who believe that Islam and Islamic law should play a prominent role in public life. So you can have the far-right Islamists who are extremists and terrorists, like those of ISIS. You can also have non-violent Islamists who are gradualists, who participate in the political process. They believe in different aspects, some aspects at least, of the democratic process. They form political parties. So groups like the Muslim Brotherhood or Ennahda in Tunisia or the AK Party in Turkey, so on and so forth. So there's a wide variety of these kinds of groups. But the divide between these groups is really between Islamists and non-Islamists, or between Islamists and secularists, is so raw and existential because it's dealing with these unresolved questions around the role of Islam in these modern societies. So, when you debate economic issues or policy issues like universal health care, tax policy, those are more easy to resolve. They're challenging, but they're easy to resolve because there are actually numbers. They're more tangible, right? What's different about the debates around the role of religion and whether Sharia should actually have something to say about legal matters is that it's raw and existential. It's the most fundamental thing you can possibly debate. So how do you split the middle on that? It's not something that you can measure. And that's what makes it much more challenging. And I think that in some ways, what I've realized over the past year is when I describe this, I used to think that description only applied to the Middle East, but we're actually having some of the same debates in our own country about what it means to be American. What is the nature of the American idea or the American nation state, and how we relate to our own state. And for the first time, I think a lot of us as Americans are asking some of the same questions that I thought were pretty much a foreign thing. And I used to talk about them as primarily foreign questions. Of course, here it's not so much about religion, as I mentioned earlier, but more about questions around identity, politics, and racial issues, and class and education is overlaid with that, and so on. So this makes it very difficult to resolve political debates, because how do you do it if you really have fundamental divides between citizens and other citizens, really? And I'll just mention one example of this that I experienced in a very personal way in the Middle East. So some of you might be familiar with something called the Rabaa massacre. I don't want to go too dark here, but it's worth mentioning because it's something that's had a big effect on how I view the world and how I view resolving these really deep divides in society. So there was a military coup against a democratically elected government, July 3rd, 2013 in Egypt. So I'm born and raised in Pennsylvania, but I'm originally Egyptian. So I have a lot of relatives who are still in Egypt. And I've done a lot of field work and research in Egypt. So you have you have a coup, and then you have the military essentially threatening to come in and wipe out a protest area. So there was a sit-in, and tens of thousands of people were gathered. About 1,000 people were killed in broad daylight. And I was in Egypt right up almost until the massacre happened. I left on August 12th, and the massacre happened on August 14th. But the reason that I bring this up is because these are Egyptians had come. They had sort of had this very inspiring moment of feeling that finally they had democracy and freedom, and then just in the matter of a couple years, all that falls apart. And I had relatives in Egypt who supported the massacre. And one reason that they supported really what was essentially the mass killings of their fellow countrymen is because they felt that everything was at stake. For them, it was existential. So there had to be winners and losers. And some people would be victorious, and some people would either get killed or be put in prison. And there was no way to compromise. And that sort of captures the existential nature of these divides. If they get out of hand, it can turn into violence. So where do we go from here? So I want to just sort of bring this to a close in these last few minutes here. And one option is to say that, hey, the Middle East has to go the same route that the US and Europe did, where you go through this trajectory of going through a reformation, then you have an enlightenment, then you have secularization, and religion ceases to play such a big role in public life. It ceases to be the main dividing line between citizens. Now, I would argue that these hopes for a kind of reformation in the Muslim world are misplaced because it presumes that Islam is just like Christianity. But if Islam is not just like Christianity, then presumably many of these countries will not follow the same course that Europe or the US or the Western world or Western civilization did. And that it's okay to say not all civilizations or not all cultures follow the same exact path. And I think also it's an odd time to be making arguments that religion has to be privatized in the Middle East, or Muslims have to sort of give up this idea that Islam is going to be front and center in some way. Because I think all of us, like I said in the beginning, we live in a time where people are struggling for meaning. And if we're telling people that they essentially have to keep their religion private, that's not going to get a lot of support, especially at a time when people are trying to latch on to something. They're trying to make sense of this age of anxiety, of the insecurity that they're experiencing all around them. People are asking for more meaning, not less meaning. And I think for those of us who come from a secular background, and I'm sort of a product of all the sort of stereotypical northeastern elite areas. Live in D.C., grew up in outside of Philadelphia. My brother lives in New York. These are the places that I know the best. And I think for those of us who come from this background, this idea that religion would still hold such a powerful role, not just on the personal level of being a source of faith and inspiration, but also in a broader sense of providing meaning for larger communities or larger societies, that can seem a little bit hard for us to get our head around. And part of what I've tried to do in my own work of interviewing Islamist groups in the Middle East is to sort of understand where these ideas come from and what drives some of these actors in the Middle East. And I think I understand most of it, or a lot of it. The one thing that I think I still struggle with is where the willingness to die comes from. I don't mean the willingness to kill. Those are two different things. Where people are actually willing to die for a cause. Let's say they're at a protest, and they know that the military is going to move in. I personally, if I was in a protest and I heard the military might be moving in, I'd run for the hills. I don't have that level of commitment to a set of religious ideas. But the people who I interviewed, for example, at this protest in Cairo that I mentioned in 2013, they really believed that if they died in the service of the cause that they believed in, that they would get direct entry into paradise. So for them, the idea that that God wanted them to do this, and that there would be a specific reward, not perhaps in this life, but in the next life, that is something that can really move people for better or worse. And obviously, there are examples where that can push people sometimes to do things that are very problematic, obviously. So this idea of religion, not just in the sense of what it gives us in this life, but what it can inspire people to do of what they believe in next life, has to be sort of part of how we understand these developments. So some people want to get into heaven. Now that might seem irrational, and sometimes I get in debates and people will say, well, wanting to get into heaven is a pretty irrational thing if that's what's inspiring you to join a political party or go to a protest or vote for a candidate. But at the same time, if you believe this is eternal salvation, what could be more rational? If you believe that, if that's your starting assumption, that you would do things that would help you get that eternal salvation. In some ways, that's very, very rational from a certain perspective. Okay, so where does that leave us? So it's not just, like I said, it's not just in the Middle East where people are dealing with these existential questions and questions of identity and ideology, but the idea of America is not, it seems, strong enough or powerful enough to hold all Americans together. That is the open question. I hope it might still be, but that is an open question that I think a lot of us are struggling with. The idea of France is no longer strong enough to hold all the French together. Hungary and Poland are entering into what might very well be a long ideological struggle over the meaning of Poland and the meaning of Hungary. So that is a kind of challenge that I think a lot of different countries and nations are going to have to deal with. Now, when I get to the end of a talk, I always try to think, well, how can I sort of pivot to be more inspiring or positive? because I've realized I haven't been very much on the positive end. So I'll try to pivot and offer a kind of what I would think to be a glimmer of hope. Now, I'm not someone who believes, as you can probably tell, that fundamental divides in societies can necessarily be resolved. Sometimes they can't be because we legitimately disagree on things that are very important to us, whether it's about religion, ideology, race, ethnicity, and so on. So some things simply can't be resolved. What can happen, though, is finding ways to accommodate other people's ideas or identities or religions, even if we disagree with them, even if we think they're bad and counterproductive. So in the Middle East, that might mean coming to terms with Islamist parties or Islamist groups that are peaceful but believe in things that we as Americans would consider problematic in terms of gender equality, minority rights. And the basic thing here is that people should be able to express their ideas as long as they do so peacefully and within the law and the constitution of whatever country they happen to live in. So that's obviously the red line. But within that, people should be able to express their beliefs, however problematic in quotation marks they might be. And that can be extended to Christian evangelicals in the US who advocate things on abortion or gay rights or the lack thereof, for example, or gender inequality that many of us might be uncomfortable with, but that doesn't make them un-American, that doesn't make them less American. They are still Americans or Orthodox Jews, and we can extend this to any kind of religious group that wants to express beliefs that may not be totally in keeping with secular society as we understand it today. So that's one thing. And so that's why what I would sort of advocate is a bit more modest, that people will continue to dislike and even hate each other over legitimate differences. My hope is that they hate each other peacefully. That to me is the fundamental question, is how do we find ways to disagree with each other or dislike each other? Hopefully we won't go all the way to hate, but we do it peacefully. The other thing, and I think this is a very important part of it, is that if you're American, you're American. And that would also, if you're French, you're French. It would also apply to religions. If you're Muslim, you're Muslim. No one should be able to take you outside the fold of the nation or outside the fold of Americanness, just like no one should be taken outside the fold of the faith of Islam. And that might seem very minimalistic, but it's actually something we haven't been able to do in many countries and many societies for decades now. So it might seem like I'm lowering the bar, but in some ways I'm raising it because we haven't even been able to do that much so far. And I think if we were able to get to a point where we could do that, I think it would be a positive improvement, and it also wouldn't raise expectations too high where we can't actually achieve them. So that was my effort at being optimistic right there. So thank you.
Shadi, I think you have already begun our training in muscular civil dialogue, and we thank you for the clarification that you've offered for identity for all of us and those around the world. So let's have a conversation with Shadi, and we invite those to come to the microphone to offer short questions, and we'll proceed. Okay.
Should I start? Yeah. Referring to your dichotomy between the Islamists and Muslims who believe or can work with the secular system. Interesting point is there are countries where Muslims are in a minority, and I'm thinking in particular of India, which has just about the same number of Muslims as Pakistan, but it's the largest Muslim minority. It's not going to become a majority. So does that mean that this moderate Islamists you're talking about who want to bring change through democratic means like the Egyptian Brotherhood would have no appeal in such countries because they would have no prospect of winning overall control of the government.
Yeah.
And it would only be the violent ones who would hold appeal there.
Okay, thank you. It's a great question. So this is where I would make a distinction between Muslim majority societies and Muslim minority societies. And I actually think I'm biased because I'm an American Muslim, but I think the US is actually one of the great models of Muslim integration. And if you compare our situation to, say, Muslims in France or Muslims in Britain, we're doing a lot better. And I think a big part of that is this idea, the American idea, at least up until now, maybe it'll start to change, but for a long time, the idea of America was one that everyone could sign on to. And you didn't have to give up your religion. You didn't have to give up your identity. So you could be fully Muslim, but also be fully American. You could be a very conservative Muslim, but that didn't make you less American. So I just think about, I think about my parents and how they came to really embrace the American idea. And I think that that's a beautiful thing to watch over time. And I remember the first time my parents asked me about how they could volunteer in an American political campaign in 2008. You can probably guess who it was for. That they believed that, hey, this is our country. We're going to fight for it, and we're going to take part in the political process. And after Trump proposed as a candidate the proposed Muslim ban, we actually had this very interesting conversation where we said, well, hey, if things get really bad here, what's the backup plan? So it's amazing that you even have to have that talk. So as many African Americans have to have their own version of the talk with their sons and daughters, this has sort of become the Muslim talk. What if things get really bad in our own country? But what was really inspiring, again, in this case, was we had this conversation. My dad is also a Canadian citizen, so for us, there is actually a backup plan. But putting that aside, it was really inspiring. My parents said, hey, no, we're not going to let Trump make us feel like we're less American or less whatever. Well, thank you, yeah. So, I mean, that I think is a powerful thing. So I think the other aspect of this is if you're a Muslim minority, issues around Islamic law aren't going to be as important because there's no real prospect of Muslims ever governing as a majority in America. I mean, that's not going to happen. So Muslims are a minority in the US. And so the debates that you have in countries like Egypt, Tunisia, or Turkey aren't going to be as relevant as the ones you have here, where Muslims accept that they're a minority and there isn't, people can do a lot of alarmism about the Muslims coming and invading and all of that. But hey, Muslims are 1% of the population here. There's not a lot of room for freaking out. Now, India is a very interesting case. I haven't, unfortunately, been able to do much work on the Indian Muslim community, but they have the smallest per capita contribution of foreign fighters to ISIS. So even though there are more than 100,000 100 million, I should say, so massive numbers, more than 100 million Indian Muslims, the number of people who have gone to fight for ISIS in Syria is microscopic. It's literally a handful. So I think that that's an inspiring model and one that deserves more attention. Yeah.
Shadi, we've had attempts to converse with each other before. I've read the book twice, a year ago when it came out, and when I saw that you would be here, I read it again, and I found it much more favorable. I think you do an admirable job of describing the issues in Tunisia, in Turkey, in places where attempted or quasi-democratic Egypt have come. But you don't bring up any place that's a Shia. All the places you talk about seem to be Sunni. And you don't talk anything about, the difficulties, if there are difficulties in Asia, in Indonesia, we don't read about that. And then I also want to say that I think your title is false advertising because how the struggle over Islam is shaping the world, I don't think you answer that question. You talk about how Islam is trying to adjust itself in these various nations, you know, and you do a good job of telling how difficult it is for the Islamists to go with the the more secular and not. Well, Tunisia, I think, is an example where they've agreed that we're going to disagree, but we won't do it violently. Now, the question is whether that's going to take place or not.
Yeah.
But I'd like to know how the struggle over Islam is reshaping the world, and I don't think you answer that question.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, so look, I mean, it's interesting to see that since the book has come out, how people respond in very different ways to it. I am happy to hear that the second time it was more favorable. So the lesson there is that if you read it once and you still don't like it, try a second time and then, well, keep on going. But I think that in terms of the title, so the main argument is actually right there in the title. So I do think that, so it's actually funny you mentioned that. We did have a debate at the very last moment about what we would title the book. And there was some internal debate with my publisher. I won't tell you what the other one was. I didn't think it was good, and I'm glad that we went with this. And I think that part of it was about wanting to own what could have potentially been an off-putting or controversial argument, and one that I'm even in some ways not 100% comfortable with. And some people have misused my arguments to say, look, there's Shadi Hamid. He's an American Muslim, and even he thinks Islam is different. But of course, for me, difference isn't a bad thing. That's not where I think for some people, especially on the far right, Islam being different is seen as a threat. So I'm very attuned to this particular concern. Now, in terms of the broader world, I chose a number of case studies to focus on because I'm a believer that you can't cover everything. And you know, there are obviously Shia cases. So there's two Shia majority countries that would be relevant are Iraq and Iran. I didn't want to bite off more than I could chew, so I decided to focus on a specific set of countries and a specific set of ideas. I did also try to talk about Indonesia and Malaysia in parts of the book, and also there's discussion of France in the final chapter. But anyway, titles are titles. All the more reason to read the book and come to your own conclusions. But I'm glad that you did, and I thank you for your question.
I had a question too about Sunni and Shia. My understanding is that a lot of the terrorism that we read about and cars exploding in marketplaces have to do more with Sunni and Shia than any animosity toward the West. And I'm wondering if you could speak a bit about, do you think there has to be some resolution about those two arms of Islam before we can address a threat against the West?
So it's interesting. When I was growing up, I didn't actually know what kind of Muslim I was. So it's changed. Now it's like, are you Sunni? Are you Shia? What does that mean? I didn't have a strong sense of that. Well, to be fair, I did grow up in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania. But putting that aside, even growing up in the Muslim community, it's not something. And even if you talk to older Iraqis, they will say, "Hey, this didn't used to be the fundamental divide in Iraq." Or you talk to Syrians, "Hey, we used to work together, friends, Alawites, Shias, Sunnis." It was quite diverse. So something has changed. Part of it has to do with the Iraq War and how the Iraq War really brought some of these sentiments to the surface. That's part of what you have. When you have a dictator who suppresses all identities and says, you can't even express anything or else you might be put in jail, people aren't gonna talk about these issues. Once you have an opening of political space, and once you have a democratic process, however flawed, people are going to express new identities. And I think we saw that in a negative way in the case of Iraq, where you had sort of Shia and Sunni sectarian groups emerging. And that starts to be the main dividing line in Iraq, and then it starts to be the main dividing line in Syria with the start of the Arab Spring. And that's, in a sense, affected the rest of the region in a very destructive way. Now, the question is, can we go back to the way things were before? But once you sort of take the genie out of the bottle, you can't undo the damage. So there are ways to sort of tamp it down, but once these identities become very sharp, that's how people start to understand themselves. And unfortunately, there are certain powerful players, whether it's the Saudis or the Iranians, that they are taking what in many ways is a geopolitical divide, and they are using sectarian language, and they're using very dangerous religious appeals to dehumanize the other side. And maybe some of these politicians or policymakers in Saudi Arabia or Iran, maybe they don't have a big problem with the other side from a theological standpoint, but they know that that's a way to rally their base. It's a way to rally support against the other. So what should be, what in some ways is primarily a geopolitical divide, starts to have more and more of a theological and religious cast. And this is where in some ways I think we can't separate from religion from politics in our analysis. So some people ask me, well, is it fundamentally about religion or is it fundamentally about politics? But of course, in the Middle East, the two are endlessly intertwined, and it's hard to know where one ends and the other begins. And you ask someone, hey politician, or hey Islamist activist, why are you doing what you're doing? Is it because of religion or is it because of politics? That question is one that many people that I've spoken to in my interviews would have trouble answering, because for them, the two are hard to separate. And in practice, the two are hard to separate. They become intertwined. Others, yeah, please.
Sir, would you elaborate a little bit more about the possibility or the likelihood of a reformation in the Christian sense for one of the futures for Islam?
Okay.
You started initially, at least I thought you were going in the direction of saying circumstances could lead to a reformation, and then when you talked further, you said unlikely to happen. So at least
I'll elaborate on that a little bit.
Please.
Yeah. So I think that from my standpoint, it's problematic to kind of make that the hope. Now, I can't speak to what will happen in 300 years or 400 years. Anything is ultimately possible, but based on what we know now, I think it's unlikely that there will be a reformation, at least in the Christian sense of the word, anytime soon in the Muslim majority world, for the reasons that I mentioned, because Islam is different in important ways, so Islam will not necessarily follow the same trajectory. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't have ideas around reform and diversity of opinion and religious pluralism. All those things are possible. What I don't think is possible is an idea that there is going to be a privatization of Islam or a real secularization process that entrenches itself in Muslim countries. And you take two of the countries that experienced forced secularization for decades, that actually did become quite secular, at least on the governmental level, Tunisia and Turkey. These were also two of the first countries where Islamist parties came to power through democratic elections. Is that a coincidence? Probably not. So even in these cases of forced secularization, there is still a kind of return to identity and a return to ideology. And people say, hey, we want Islam to still play some role in public life, and we're going to vote for parties that believe that. So I think that if we want to be more realistic, we have to engage with the Middle East, not as we want it to be. So it's totally understandable that if you're a secularist or I'm a secularist or we believe in classical liberalism, that we would think that's the best outcome for these countries, that if only they could adopt these ideas. But we can't force people to be something they don't want to be. We can't force people to be liberal. That would also be sort of self-contradictory, because part of the classical liberal idea is individual choice and autonomy. So you can't force some, so you can see how that would be problematic. So I think we have to be a little bit more realistic in how we view these things. And in some ways, another way you could look at it is that Christianity is exceptional in certain ways, that it's the one civilization or religious tradition that had a very distinctive process of reformation followed by enlightenment and a secularization process. But I will say one thing to keep in mind when we're looking for things to be optimistic about in terms of religious pluralism, or having an Islamic approach that is more broad-minded. Even when you had caliphates 1,000 years ago, so here, Islamic law was the law of the land. In the Abbasid Caliphate, for example, more than 1,000 years ago, you still had some of the greatest civilizations the world has ever seen. So you don't need secularism necessarily to have successful societies or religious pluralism. And as many of you will know, in the Abbasid Caliphate, Baghdad was a center of intellectual thought, and some of the greatest scientists and philosophers and doctors were actually in Baghdad, and people from the Christian world would come to Baghdad to study at the seat of the great scholars in the Islamic Empire. So that's, I think, one example of how it's still possible to have Islam, as long as it's a broad-minded interpretation of Islam, play a role in public life, but it still allows for a kind of religious and intellectual pluralism.
Assalamu alaikum. With everything that happens across the world, being an American Muslim, that affects me in some way, shape, or form. But I live here. And how can I go about, what advice can you give me to go about to creating a Muslim American identity in terms of politics, while at the same time, remembering and realizing that I am in the minority?
Okay. Well, tell me a little bit more about where you think the tension is. I'd just be curious to hear what your experience has been.
At least politically, the conversations I've had with some of my friends is that, where is the relationship? How can there be a relationship between a Muslim American with what goes on in the other side of the world, us here living as Americans, and the Constitution? I heard Dr. Sherman Jackson give a talk in Stanford, and he used the Treaty of Hudaybiyah to justify that because of the document and the agreement that was made between the Muslims and the non-Muslims. So it's the same way as me being a Muslim here in the States. The agreement I have to be an American citizen and have that blue book is to abide by the rules of the Constitution. So I don't know where I stand with that. I kind of agree, and Dr. Jackson's piece is very convincing, but being 1% of the population, your voice can only be so loud.
Right, yeah.
So in terms of going about this the right way, where, the people that come after me, how can I, not make the mistake of my fathers and the uncles of the community, at the same time create a comfort space where there's no real issue being Muslim and proud and American and proud, regardless of what both sides say about each other and the foreign policy that's involved and Muslim ban and all that.
Yeah, sure. Okay, there's a lot there. It's a tough one because, we all have to struggle with our identities, and I think all of us I remember, when I was in college having a lot of these debates, and that was a time, too, after 9/11, a very challenging time. It's interesting, though, that there's more anti-Muslim sentiment, just from an empirical standpoint, in terms of targeting and harassment today than there was post 9/11. So that is new today. But still, post 9/11 was a very challenging time, and that was my sort of coming of age moment. So I think a lot of us were debating those things, 15 years ago. So I think that part of it is I'm a bit of an American exceptionalist, to use that phrase. I do think there is something very special about America. I know that not all Muslim Americans might feel it to the same extent that I do, but I really do believe in this idea that America stands for something beyond the nation state. America is not a normal nation. America is a set of ideas that I think everyone can theoretically sign on to. And I draw inspiration from that personally, I think. And so I think that, I think one example of this, my mom wears the headscarf. So it's interesting that in some ways she has more freedom to wear the headscarf and express her religious identity in America than certain Muslim majority countries where that can actually be a major issue. And there are certain countries such as in Tunisia and Turkey where wearing the headscarf prevented you from taking certain positions or even going to certain schools. It's remarkable to think that in Muslim majority countries that would be the issue. Or take, for example, France, where if a woman wants to wear a burkini, she could be taken off a beach. Luckily, we haven't had those issues. So I think that the fact that there is more freedom in some ways for Muslims to express their religious identity, if they want to. Many Muslims aren't religious and don't care and aren't practicing, and they should be able to not be practicing as well. So I think it goes both ways, and I think that to me is something that's been, I don't want to say completely unique, but has been a powerful aspect of the American Muslim experience. Are there tensions? Yeah, but I think part of being an American Muslim, or I would assume also part of being a Jewish American and other kind of hybrid identities, is that you have to sort of struggle with what's more important to you. So I guess that maybe doesn't fully answer the question, but those are some of my thoughts on that.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I have a question around the word caliphate. You mentioned it in your speech about the Ottoman Caliphate. You just referred to it in your last answer. This morning, Dame Stella Remington mentioned the idea that ISIS has a caliphate for world domination. And that's also striking fear in a lot of hearts, that this is why we have to keep Muslims out of our country, is because, they're intent on taking over. There's this big, broad assumption of what caliphate means. And then when I ask Muslim friends, they say, well, that shows up in the Quran, and it means a successor. The first caliphate is the first successor after Muhammad. The second caliphate is the second. So from a linguistic point of view, apparently it has multiple meanings. Or is it the same? Is this guy, is al-Baghdadi saying, I'm a caliphate, I'm a successor to Muhammad, therefore I can do this? I mean, I'm just a little bit confused as a non-Arabic speaker.
Sure, yeah. So there is the idea of the caliphate in a kind of utopian sense, and there's this kind of aspect of nostalgia. So, I mean, even I remember growing up, and even spending summers in Egypt and hearing conversations that pretty much went along these lines of, hey, we used to be one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever seen, and now we kind of suck. How did this happen? It's a pretty, sometimes it would be expressed in even starker terms than that. But, so it's a question of how, it's such a precipitous rise and fall. And like I said, there is this wonderful history of a very rich and diverse civilization, 1,000 years ago, 800 years ago, depending on which period you're talking about. So I think there is a nostalgic element in Muslim communities of how did we get to this point? And there were previous eras where the caliphate as an idea was something that was very positive. What ISIS did, they took what was in the eyes of many Muslims a positive idea, and they appropriated that and made it into something very destructive and very negative. So we have to make a distinction between ISIS's version of the caliphate and the caliphate as an idea in history, right? So that's one part of it. And I think that the caliphate can be an idea. It can be something that certain people in the Middle East are nostalgic over. You don't hear a lot of people talking about it in the West because, like I said, if you have high levels of integration, you're not going to be thinking about the caliphate. That's not a relevant concept to you. You're not worried about that as an American Muslim. But I do think there is a broader sense when people talk about the caliphate, sometimes they're using it in the sense that Muslims throughout the world are part of a transnational community, that if a Muslim meets another Muslim in, say, Indonesia or in France, that the fact that they're both Muslim will be a common shared identity that's meaningful to them. That doesn't have to be threatening. And there are, I think there are other transnational identities that people value, and that's fine. And I think the caliphate speaks to this idea, at least in a kind of historical sense of, hey, there was a time before nation states, and nation states haven't solved the problem. And you'll hear that if you go in the Middle East. Hey, I like the idea of being Egyptian to some extent, but also it hasn't solved the fundamental problems that are affecting the region. And the caliphate as an idea speaks to this, hey, maybe we could be united. Maybe there is a way that you could have a kind of EU-like situation where you still have nations, but they cooperate more across borders. That can be sort of a modern take on this idea of transnational community.
I'm happy to hear that, just because it feels like that word's been hijacked in the last 10 years, or 3 years, whatever, in a very negative sense. And of course, to hear it this morning, equal world domination, I felt like
some people, we also have to be honest, there are some Muslims who, when they use the word caliphate, they do think it is about world domination, and that's obviously a minority of Muslims who are influential in some parts of the Muslim world, and they see it in those terms of dominion and domination. But it's a minority of it's a minority. They're a vocal minority. Some of them are violent. ISIS is one example of this. But again, this is why I think it's very important to draw careful distinctions between different groups. We're talking about 1.6 billion people. You're going to find a lot of diversity in that group of people who have very different views. You say, hey, the caliphate, and you take 5 Muslims, and they all have different interpretations of what the caliphate means to them. It's the same thing of you take 5 Muslims and you say, hey, what does it mean that the Quran isn't just the word of God, but God's actual speech? Like I said, that every letter and word is directly from God. 5 Muslims might agree on that, but for them, how you interpret God's actual speech in the modern context differs in really important ways. So that level of diversity is really, I think, really important to keep in mind, that when people are talking about the Muslim world, Islam, Muslims as some kind of undifferentiated mass, every community is going to have a lot of diversity inside of it.
Thank you.
You have 5 minutes? Okay, so let's take maybe
keep it
1 or
short.
2 more.
Okay, very short questions. Part of the utopia of Chautauqua is the Abrahamic tradition, and the 3 branches of ethical monotheism have a lot in common, including the Golden Rule. If you were Secretary of State, how would you modify the current program for public diplomacy and engagement, particularly digital engagement, with the Muslim world?
Okay.
Thank you.
That's short.
I don't know. Are people responding because they don't think that I could be like? Anyway, if I was secretary, certainly that wouldn't be realistic anytime soon. But okay, I'll just say a couple things very quickly, because I'm a little bit skeptical of messaging and public diplomacy, because I worry that when we focus so much on the message and how we convey the message, we don't realize that a big part of the problem is that the message isn't that good, that the substance, the content has major problems, and we can't just give it a nice sheen and say, hey, we're going to be on Twitter, or we're going to be on Facebook, or we're going to reach out to new digital audiences or young people. If your message isn't good, if your message doesn't address the real grievances people have in the Muslim majority world over policies, over people are understandably angry about some of our more problematic policies, whether it's a legacy of the Iraq War, our support for autocratic regimes, the list goes on, and many of you will be familiar with these criticisms. So I think that I'm totally in favor of being more digitally savvy and reaching out to new audiences, but we can't let that be the focus. That's one piece of a much bigger puzzle.
3 minutes.
Yeah, okay, 3 minutes.
Okay, well, I'm from Minneapolis, and we are having a kind of, and I follow on Twitter because I'm not there, I'm here for the summer, but we did just have a explosion in Minneapolis, and I've heard from, Trump landed in Minneapolis in November, disparaged our entire pretty big Muslim community, Somalian, it's a large community, and then has not said a word about like any of the attacks on the Muslim community in this country. And I think that when we're talking about fear and the unknown, and I guess I just want to know, like, when we talk about this global thing, how do we talk about it globally without freaking out and excluding? I know in Minneapolis now, I just saw they had 1,000 people come, and all these different religious leaders came just to come together and kind of flip off the country and stand by our community. But I was just wondering, like, how do you do that without, if the government, if our leadership isn't going to try to quell any of that, you've got a lot of fearful people, and when you live in fear and people are afraid of you, that just can't be good. Okay.
I agree 100%. So, look, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do about this because it really depends on who our leaders are. It is a scary thing to see that if there are attacks on a mosque, if Muslims are being targeted in different parts of our country, that our own elected leadership, whether or not I voted for him, he is my president. He is, and I believe he was elected, and I have to respect outcomes. But it does hurt, in a kind of way, when your own president does not see you as equally legitimate. Let's say that can be a frightening thing. And I think that can sometimes be hard to relate to, and I would just ask everyone here to sort of try to relate to what that might feel like if you were part of a group and the president, said disparaging things about you, or wouldn't even speak out about certain attacks that have been, where mosques are actually being, and some of those attacks don't get much attention because they aren't committed by Muslims, and terrorist attacks that are committed by Muslims do get more attention. That's the way it's been. And other attacks, people don't seem to care as much. So I think that I would hope that, some of it might be a long-term thing, that in my generation or younger generations, that we will learn from those mistakes and there will be a more inclusive approach. But it's just sad to see, and I think it also has major national security implications. If we alienate local Muslim communities, those are the people that we cooperate with when it comes to fighting extremism. If there is a problematic individual at a local mosque who's saying problematic things, but you don't want to tell the government or local law enforcement because you think they're anti-Muslim and they're going to mistreat him in some basic way. And I'm not talking about what if, there are those questions about what do you do if there's someone who says something that could be construed as problematic on the local level. And you need to have cooperation from local Muslim communities. And you have to have good relationships between local law enforcement and local Muslim communities. I guess I think we're out of time. Well, thank you. I enjoyed the conversation.